Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today we're diving into a chilling twist. Uri finally finds Mrs. Nghia hiding at an old friend's house. But within minutes, an unknown number sends a photo proving they've been watched the whole time. Who is tracking them, and what will Uri do to protect his mother and Tu Tieu? If you enjoy the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next episode. Uri didn't sleep that night. Not because he couldn't close his eyes, but because every time he tried, he heard that unfinished warning again. Uri, don't! And every time the sentence cut off, his mind filled in a different ending. Don't come alone. Don't trust anyone. Don't let them use you. Don't let Tu Tieu get hurt. He sat at the kitchen table with Tu Tieu, both of them wrapped in the cold glow of a single lamp. The house around them felt unfamiliar, like it had lost its warmth the moment Mrs. Nghia stopped being in it. Tu Tieu kept her phone face up, waiting for it to buzz. Uri did the same, but when he noticed her fingers trembling, he reached across the table and gently covered her hand with his. You don't have to carry the fear by yourself, he said softly. Tu Tieu's eyes shined. Neither do you. Uri gave her a small, grateful smile, one that looked like love fighting to stay steady. Then his gaze dropped to the few scraps of information they'd collected like fragile evidence. The neighbour who said she hadn't been seen for days, the mention of Lin's neighbourhood, the uneasy silence from Mr. Tuan, the way everything seemed to point in circles without ever landing on something real. We need something solid, Uri murmured. Not rumours, not guesses. Tu Tieu nodded. A pattern. Uri looked up. A person. They sat quietly for a moment, thinking the same thought from different angles. Mrs. Nghia had always been private. She carried worry like it was her job. But when life hurt her deeply, she didn't run to strangers. She ran to someone safe. Someone from before the company, before the money, before the scandal. Someone who remembered her as a young woman, not just as Uri's mother. Tu Tieu leaned forward, voice gentle. Uri, who did your mum trust back then, before everything got so complicated? Uri stared at the table as if the answer might rise from the wood grain. Then his expression shifted. Subtle, but unmistakable. A memory unlocking. My mum had a friend, he said quietly. A close friend. From years ago. Tu Tieu's breath caught. Like family? Uri nodded. Like a sister. She used to call her Mai. The name fell between them like a candle being lit in a dark room. Tu Tieu straightened. Do you know where she lives? Uri shook his head slowly. Not exactly. It's been a long time. But I remember the neighbourhood. I remember my mum saying Mai's place was where she could breathe when the world got loud. Tu Tieu reached for his hand. Then we start there. Uri squeezed her fingers gently. Yes, we start there. They left before sunrise. The city was still half asleep, streets quiet, sky washed in pale blue-grey. The cold morning light made everything look calmer than it was, like the world hadn't caught up to their panic yet. Uri drove with both hands steady on the wheel. He didn't speed, he didn't slam the brakes. He drove like someone who understood that fear could make you careless, and carelessness could make you lose the person you loved most. Tu Tieu watched him from the passenger seat, noticing the small things, his steady breathing, the way he glanced at his phone like it might ring again, the way he kept checking on her with quick, warm looks. You're holding up, she whispered. Uri glanced over and gave a tiny smile. Because you're here. Tu Tieu's throat tightened. I'm not leaving you. He reached over at the red light and gently squeezed her hand once, simple, steady, full of meaning. As they reached the older part of town, the buildings changed. The roads narrowed. Trees leaned over the sidewalks like they were listening. The morning air smelled faintly of damp leaves and fresh bread. Uri slowed near an intersection that looked familiar in the way dreams look familiar. I remember this street, he murmured. There used to be a bakery here. Tu Tieu looked out. A small shop was open, warm light spilling onto the sidewalk. A man swept the front step with sleepy movements. Uri parked and stepped out. Tu Tieu followed, staying close. The bakery owner glanced up, cautious at first. Uri approached politely, voice respectful. "Sir, I'm sorry to bother you. I'm looking for someone. A woman named Mai. She used to live nearby," the man squinted. "Mai?" Uri nodded. "She was friends with my mother. My mother's name is Nghia." At the name, the man's expression shifted, recognition softening his face. "Ah," he said slowly. "Nghia. Yes. Kind woman." Uri's heart jumped. "Do you know where Mai lives now?" The man hesitated, then lowered his voice as if the street could overhear. "Mai still lives near the Lotus Pond Street. Not far. But why are you asking?" Uri swallowed. He didn't dramatize it. He didn't raise his voice. He simply told the truth, because truth was urgent. "My mother is missing." The owner's eyes widened. Tu Tieu stepped closer, gentle but firm. "We think she might have gone to someone she trusts." The man nodded slowly. "If she's missing, she would go to Mai." Those words sent a rush of relief through Uri so strong he had to breathe through it. He kept his voice calm anyway, because hope was fragile. "Can you guide us?" he asked. The man lifted his chin down the road. 2 blocks. Turn left at the banyan tree. White gate. Blue flowers on the fence. Uri repeated it quietly like a prayer. White gate. Blue flowers. They thanked him and returned to the car. Uri drove slowly now, eyes scanning every corner like the banyan tree might hide from him. 2 blocks. There, an enormous banyan tree, roots thick and tangled like history. Uri turned left, and then he saw it. A white gate. Blue flowers climbing along the fence, soft and drooping in the cool air. Uri parked. For a second, neither of them moved. Tu Tieu whispered, "Uri." He nodded, throat tight. "This is it." They stepped out together. Uri walked to the gate and knocked. Not hard, not demanding, just hopeful. A moment passed, then footsteps, slow, careful. A woman's voice called from inside. "Who is it?" Uri's voice came out soft and respectful, like he didn't want to frighten anyone in that house. "Aunt Mai, it's Uri." Silence. Then the gate opened just a little. An older woman peered out, eyes sharp, hair pulled back. When she saw Uri, her hand flew to her mouth. "Uri," she whispered, "my goodness, you're back." Uri's chest rose with a shaky breath. "Aunt Mai, I'm sorry. I need to ask. Is my mother here?" Mai didn't answer right away. Her eyes flicked down the street, left, right, checking for shadows. Then she opened the gate wider. "Come in," she said quickly. "Both of you, now." Tu Tieu's breath caught. Uri instinctively took her hand and they stepped inside together. The yard was small but lived in. Wind chimes hung near the doorway. Potted plants lined the path. A little table sat under a tree like someone still believed in tea and conversation. Uri's eyes scanned the space in a single desperate sweep, and then he saw her. Mrs. Nghia sat near the back door, wrapped in a cardigan, hands folded tightly in her lap like she was holding herself together. Her hair was slightly messier than usual, her face was pale, but she was real, alive. Uri stopped breathing, then he moved forward slowly, as if a sudden motion might make her vanish again. "Mom," he whispered. Mrs. Nghia lifted her head. Her eyes met his, and everything she'd been holding back shattered in that single look. "Uri?" Her voice cracked. Uri crossed the yard and knelt in front of her, taking her hands gently as if she were made of glass. "I'm here," he said softly. "I'm right here." Mrs. Nghyia's lips trembled. Tears spilled down her cheeks. She tried to speak again, but her voice broke, and all she could do was squeeze his hands like she was afraid he'd disappear too. Uri held on, steady and warm. He didn't rush her. He didn't demand explanations. He just stayed there, close enough for her to feel his presence. Tu Tieu stood a step behind him, tears sliding quietly down her face. When Mrs. Nghia finally looked past Uri and saw her, Tu Tieu's breath hitched. "Mrs. Nghia," Tu Tieu whispered. Mrs. Nghia's gaze softened, heavy with guilt and relief at the same time. Tu Tieu stepped closer, trembling. "I was so scared," she said. "I searched everywhere." Mrs. Nghia reached out with a shaky hand. Tu Tieu took it like it was something sacred. Yuri's voice stayed gentle, but it carried a quiet firmness now, the kind that comes from love turning into protection. "Mum," he said softly, "you don't have to do this alone." Mrs. Nghia closed her eyes, tears falling faster. "I didn't want you to come back to this," she whispered. Yuri shook his head slowly. "I don't care about this. I care about you." Aunt Mai stood near the doorway, arms crossed tightly, watching them with worried eyes. "She came late at night," Mai said, voice low. Shaking, she begged me not to call anyone. Mrs. Nghia's shoulders trembled. "Because if Lin finds me..." She stopped, like the name itself was dangerous. Uri didn't force her to finish. He simply leaned closer, still holding her hands, his voice like a blanket around her. "You're safe here," he promised, "and we'll figure out the rest, together." Mrs. Nghia looked at Yuri, then at Tu Tieu, and for a moment there was something like fragile hope in her eyes, hope she didn't dare to trust. Outside the gate, the morning stayed cold and quiet. But inside that small yard, under soft blue flowers and trembling wind chimes, the three of them finally breathed the same air again. And Yuri knew, deep in his bones, this was only the beginning. Because finding his mother was one thing, understanding why she ran was another. Mrs. Nghia sat very still, as if any sudden movement might invite the fear back into the yard. Uri stayed beside her, one hand resting lightly over hers, his voice low and warm. Tu Tieu stood close too, quiet, present, eyes soft with steady care. "Mum," Yuri said gently, "you're safe here, but I need to understand what scared you enough to disappear." "It started after the company collapsed," Mrs. Nghia whispered. "Calls from people I didn't know, not questions, warnings." Tu Tieu's breath caught. "From Lin?" Mrs. Nghia flinched. Not her voice. A man. Calm. Like he enjoyed it. Yuri's focus sharpened. "What did he say?" "He said if I stayed where you could find me, you would come running," Mrs. Nghia said, tears building. "And if you came running, they'd ruin you, your work, your name, make you look guilty for things you never did." Yuri leaned closer, tenderness steady in his eyes. "So you ran to protect me?" Mrs. Nghia nodded, ashamed. "I thought if I vanished, the storm would pass over you." "It won't," Yuri said softly, "and you don't have to face it alone." Aunt Mai hovered near the doorway. "She arrived shaking," Mai added. "Begged me not to call anyone." Mrs. Nghia reached into her cardigan and pulled out a small phone. "This is the only number I've used. Aunt Mai gave it to me." Tu Tieu's gaze turned sharp. The threats came through that phone. Mrs. Nghia unlocked it with trembling fingers and showed them a short, anonymous thread. No name, no photo, only a number and cold lines that made her swallow hard. Yuri read quietly, then looked up with calm certainty. "They want control. They want you isolated. And they want me scared enough to stop." Mrs. Nghia clutched Yuri's sleeve. "Please, don't do anything dangerous." Yuri squeezed her hand gently. "We'll do this smart and legal. The goal is to bring you home safely." Tu Tieu nodded. One message from this phone, short, designed to make them react. No location, no details. Mrs. Nghia's eyes widened. "If I message them, won't they come?" "Only if we give them something to follow," Yuri said. "We won't." He looked at her carefully. "Only if you're okay with it." Mrs. Nghia stared at the screen like it could bite, then gave a small nod. "Okay." Tu Tieu typed, showed Yuri, and pressed send. The yard went still, then the phone buzzed almost instantly. Tu Tieu read the reply aloud. "You're lying." Yuri stayed calm. "Fast. They're watching the phone." Mrs. Nghia's hands folded tight. "What do we do?" "One response," Yuri said gently. "Then we stop." Tu Tieu typed, "Try us. Send." Seconds crawled. Yuri kept his hand on his mother's shoulder, steady and warm. Buzz. Another message. "Bring the money, or she moves." Mrs. Nghia gasped softly. Tu Tieu went pale. Aunt Mai's jaw tightened. Yuri's expression narrowed into thought, not rage. They're trying to force panic, and they still don't know where you are. If they did, they wouldn't be texting. Mrs. Nghia searched his face. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure enough to stay calm," Yuri said. "Calm is how we win." Tu Tieu nodded. "We don't answer again." "Yes," Yuri agreed. "No more messages." Aunt Mai stepped forward, voice tense. "Then you two leave. Don't bring eyes back to my street." Yuri nodded respectfully. "Thank you for protecting her." He turned to his mother. "Mum, we need to move you somewhere they can't predict. Not because this isn't safe, but because it's now a target." Mrs. Nghia's face crumpled. "I didn't want trouble to touch Mai." Mai's eyes were wet. "Don't apologize for surviving." Tu Tieu spoke with practical steadiness. "We relocate Mrs. Nghia first, then we build the trap. Yuri and I will get real records from Mr. Tuan, bank transfers, contract copies, anything with Lin's signature, then involve legal help. If we do it clean, Lin can't twist the story and make you look guilty." Mrs. Nghia shook her head weakly. "Mr. Tuan won't help. He's afraid." Yuri nodded, already thinking. "Then we don't ask him to be brave," he said softly. "We ask him to be smart. We remind him that silence won't protect him if Lin decides to blame him next. He'll talk when he realizes he's not safe either." Aunt Mai's voice hardened. "And where will you take her?" Yuri glanced at Tu Tieu, then back to his mother. "Somewhere neutral," he said. "A place with cameras, a front desk, witnesses. Somewhere a threat can't quietly reach you. We'll check in under a different name, keep the curtains closed, and move again if we have to. It's not forever. It's just until we regain control." Yuri helped Mrs. Nghia gather only what mattered. Her medication, a small wallet, a scarf that still smelled faintly of home. Aunt Mai pressed an old coat into her arms and adjusted the collar like a sister would, eyes shining but stubborn. Mrs. Nghia tried to protest, but Yuri shook his head gently. "Mum," he whispered, "light and quiet. The less we carry, the faster we move." Mrs. Nghia nodded, wiping her cheeks with the edge of the scarf, trying to borrow strength from the simple routine of getting ready to leave. Yuri squeezed Tu Tieu's hand for a heartbeat, grateful, loving, then began helping his mother stand. And that's when Tu Tieu's own phone buzzed. Unknown number. Yuri leaned in, whispering, "Don't answer." It rang, then stopped. A second later, an image arrived. Tu Tieu opened it and the colour drained from her face. A photo of Aunt Mai's white gate, blue flowers on the fence taken from outside in the same morning light. Proof. "They know," Tu Tieu whispered. Mrs. Nghia made a small, terrified sound and grabbed Yuri's arm. Yuri shifted between her and the gate, protective but gentle. "Everyone inside. Now." Aunt Mai bolted the door. Tu Tieu pulled the curtains. Yuri guided his mother to the back room, then knelt in front of her, eyes soft but unbreakable. "Mom," he said, "look at me. You're not alone. We're moving you today quietly. No lights, no calls." Mrs. Nghia's tears spilled. "Yuri, I'm so afraid." Yuri brushed her cheek with his thumb. "I know, but fear doesn't get to decide for us." Tu Tieu stepped closer. "We leave separately, 2 routes, and we keep the burner phone here so they keep watching the wrong thing." Yuri gave a small nod. "Good." Tu Tieu's phone buzzed again. One more message, plain text. "Don't make this harder." Yuri didn't flinch. He covered his mother's hand with both of his and spoke like a vow. "Then tell them," he murmured. "We're done being afraid." He stood, helped Mrs. Nghia to her feet, and turned toward the door with Tu Tieu at his side. 2 steady hearts moving as one, while the people watching outside tried to decide which way the story would break. Yuri and Tu Tieu finally tracked down Mrs. Nghia, discovering she's been hiding at her old friend Mai's house after disappearing without a trace. Mrs. Nghia explains she fled out of fear, not only of Lin, but of a calm, unknown man who threatened that if Uri searched for her, they would destroy his future and frame him for crimes he didn't commit. To regain control, Uri and Tu Tieu send a short bait message from a burner phone, pressuring the threat to respond. The replies come instantly, demanding money and warning she moves, confirming someone is actively monitoring them. They decide to stop responding, relocate Mrs. Nghia, and build a careful legal trap to force Lin into making a mistake. But just as they prepare to leave, Tu Tieu receives a photo of Mai's gate, proof they've been watched all along.